So we've got a couple more different types of encumbrances we need to touch on real quick before we move on into the next subject matter. But just as a review, remember, an encumbrance is anything that would render a property unmarketable. Okay, and we've talked about several different possible examples of what an encumbrance could be. And again, there's two or three more we need to touch on real quick. But anyway, so we cannot have these encumbrances. If they exist, you cannot sell or convey the property. So that's why these are so important to understand what they are. Well, this next encumbrance is something called a lis pendens, which obviously I believe is a Latin word. But lis pendens just means there's a lawsuit pending. Okay? For example, and probably the most common, at least in real estate, is if the bank decides to foreclose. Okay? Now, typically, if they're going to foreclose, there's a couple of actions, legal actions they have to take. And the first legal action they'll take is to file what we call a lis pendens. They'll file it in the public record. And that basically gives notice to the public that there's now a lawsuit pending on this property. And once that lis pendens is filed, you will not be selling the property or conveying the property to anybody else until this lis pendens or lawsuit has been resolved, either through the actual foreclosure or if there's something the homeowner can do to prevent the foreclosure. But at any rate, as long as that lawsuit is still pending, that lis pendens is filed, you cannot convey the property. So lis pendens would be another encumbrance. But then here we talk about something called a license. Now, this again is another one of these areas that potentially could create an encumbrance. Certainly not all licenses that we're getting ready to talk about would be considered an encumbrance, but they can be. Okay, just sort of depends on what it is and what it's requiring. But first of all, let me make clear, when we talk about a license here, we're not talking like a driver's license or a real estate license. Here we're talking about, if you have a license, that means you have a right to use someone else's land. We call that a non-possessory interest. Again, you don't own the property, you don't possess the property, but you've been given rights to use the property for whatever reason, okay? So that's what we talk about, a non-possessory type interest, a license. But then there's something called, also you see this term called profit apprende. Now, first of all, I know that's probably not how you pronounce that word. It's my understanding that that's a French word, and I don't speak French. But if I ever go to France or Montreal, wherever they speak French, I'll learn how to say it properly. But in my part of the world where I live, we pronounce it profit apprende. So there you go. But it says that would be the right to remove something from someone else's property. So what are we talking about here? If you've been granted a license, it means you have the right to use someone else's property for some purpose. It could be anything. For example, just an example, maybe my neighbor went and bought one of these large campers. What do they call them? Mine just went totally blank. But one of these large campers, motorhomes, and now they have nowhere to park it. Maybe they got a small yard or something like that, and it just so happens I have a lot more yard, a lot more space. So they asked me, Frankie, would you mind if we park our $1 million motorhome on your property? Because we don't have any room for it, just sort of back there out the way. And being a good neighbor, I say, sure, you can do that. Well, then, I've granted them a license. They're using my land for some purpose. Now, how does that differ from profit apprende? Well, profit apprende is when you allow someone to come onto your property and remove something from your property. Maybe I've got a lot of trees, potential firewood, so I allow someone to come on my property and cut down some trees for firewood. Well, obviously they're removing the wood, the trees, from my property. Again, that's profit apprende. So that's really all you need to know about when it comes to a license, is basically the right to use someone else's property, even though you don't own it or possess the property. But the last type of encumbrance we want to touch on here is this something called an encroachment. Now I will tell you, this is a big deal. This is very common, unfortunately, in real estate, and it can it can create a lot of legal issues. Okay, we don't want to do that. We don't need any legal problems if we can help it. But an encroachment. An encroachment is when you have one property owner encroaching, has built something, for example, that is crossed over or built it over onto their neighbor's property. You see this kind of stuff all the time. Maybe the property owner believed they knew exactly where the property line was and built this shed, which they thought was on their property. But then maybe one day in the future they find out the property line is not where they thought it was. And as it turns out, now 2 or 3 feet of that shed is actually over the property line. Well, that's an encroachment. Now, why does that matter? Why is that a big deal? Well, look at this definition of an encroachment. It says it's unauthorized and or illegal. There's the key word. It is illegal. It's an illegal intrusion of a property owner onto that of another property owner. Encroachments are illegal. And I'll have students in the classroom actually ask me, well, what if the two neighbors just agree it's okay? It doesn't cross over that much, not that big a deal, we're not going to worry about it. Well, you don't have to worry about it, and that's fine that you want to try to help each other out, but that doesn't change the fact that it's illegal. Two people can't come together and agree that something illegal is okay. That's not the way it works here, okay? It's still illegal, whether you're okay with it or not. So, that would have to be fixed. If you're going to convey that property, you can't convey the property with an illegal intrusion. That can affect all kinds of issues. Title insurance. There are a lot of problems that could exist here, especially if you do it with knowledge of this encroachment. This has got to be remedied according to the law. We're not going to get into how all that remedy would be. Obviously, you could just move the shed or tear it down or whatever you need to do. But at the end of the day, the only way you're going to remedy it is to move it. Okay? It cannot be crossing the property line like that onto someone else's property. That's a no-no. So, that's what an encroachment is. And again, that kind of wraps up all the different types of potential encroachment, or encumbrances. There's been quite a few of them. Again, no one expects you to be an expert when it comes to any of them, but you at least need to know the definition. Okay, what is it? What's an encroachment? What's an easement? What's a lien? You just need to know what it is. That's all you're expected to understand as a real estate professional. Okay, obviously, should you ever be trying to give any of your clients advice, for example, if you know you got a shed that's crossing over the property line, should you give them advice on what they should do about it? No. That's not your lane. Stay in your lane. But do you have an obligation to disclose that in this case, encroachment or whatever encumbrance may exist, do you have a duty to disclose it if you have knowledge of it? Absolutely, you do. And then you need to let talk to a surveyor or whoever, or an attorney, whoever the expert would be, obviously depending on what the encumbrance is, and let them handle it. But you have to be aware of these types of things, and certainly for test purposes, you better know what it is, or at least what the definition of it would be. Okay?